Back in 1875, the U.S. Department of Justice decided it was time to get the Indian Territory under control. For 45 years, these lands had been set aside for tribes affected by the Indian Removal Act, and the region was one of the few pockets of America that remained untamed. Since being forced from their traditional lands, the populations of the Seminole, Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw had actually increased quite dramatically since moving west, but their combined numbers were still just a few 100,000. Wide open spaces and empty land were easy to find in the Indian Territory, which made it a great place to get lost. Bandits and desperados commonly used these lands to hide out and avoid the law, but lawmakers were ready for this to change. A new deputy marshal had been hired to hunt for outlaws, and thanks to his own time spent hiding there, he was as comfortable in Indian Territory as he was with his Colt 45 peacemakers. From slave to fugitive to citizen to lawman, his name was Bass Reeves. In 1838, Bass was born a slave in Crawford County, Arkansas, on the eastern edge of Indian Territory. He was owned by the Reeves, a political family who had distant connections to both Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. When he was 8, he was moved to Grayson County, Texas, on the banks of the Red River to be the personal servant for Sheriff George Reeves. Young Bass learned to ride and hunt, and his incredible gun skills were known far and wide. Showing the true power of knowledge, Bass was trusted with deadly weapons, but not with education, and he was kept away from schooling and learning to read. The Civil War began in 1861, and George Reeves joined the Confederate Army as an officer. Bass was now a grown man, but as a slave, he had no control over his life. He dreamed of freedom, but when Captain Reeves left for war, Bass was forced to go with. However, Bass just couldn't bring himself to serve an army whose reason for fighting was to keep him enslaved. So when an opening to escape presented itself, he took it. Runaway slaves like Bass were punished severely, and capture meant torture. He needed to disappear and knew just the place: Indian Territory. While the war between the states raged, Bass hid in Indian Territory and got himself an education. To avoid slave catchers, he learned Indian languages and customs, as well as tracking and survival skills. Then, in 1865, the war ended with a Confederate defeat. Slavery was outlawed all across the USA, and Bass went from fugitive to free man. As an American citizen, Bass returned to his roots in northwest Arkansas, started a family, and took up life as a peaceful farmer. With war over, America was literally ready to get down to business. Train tracks began stretching westward, and a transcontinental railroad was finished in 1869. Cowboys could now drive cattle from ranches in South Texas up to the railroads, and then beef could be shipped across the country. The cattle industry boomed, and all that money being made attracted some unsavory characters. Cattle towns and trails became hotbeds for illegal activity, and crime swept across the South Plains. Since 3 of the 4 major cattle trails cut through Indian Territory, the U.S. Marshals needed somebody familiar with the area. And in 1875, they came looking for a Mr. Bass Reeves. At 37 years old, Bass became a federal peace officer. He had never been much of a farmer, but Deputy Reeves took to law enforcement like a duck to water. Not only was he a master with a rifle and revolver, but with his tracking skills and knowledge of Indian languages, Bass also quickly developed into a superior detective. For the next 32 years, he brought many of the most ruthless criminals of the day to justice. Bass got into gunfights with murderers and hunted down thieves, bootleggers, and crooks. During his legendary career, it's said that he shot dead 14 outlaws and made over 3,000 arrests. Along the way, he was as famous for his honesty and integrity as he was for gunslinging. While there were plenty of close calls, remarkably, Bass was never wounded. In 1907, Indian Territory transformed into the state of Oklahoma, and Bass finished his career as a police officer there. He had been born a slave, but in 1910, after an incredible life and decades of honorably protecting and serving his country, Bass Reeves died an American hero. A few years later, New Mexico and Arizona were admitted to the Union, and every gap between the Atlantic and Pacific had now been filled. The United States had come a long way from when the country had been born.